All right, we've reached 9 o'clock, but I still see people joining, so I'm going to give us another minute or two as we're having some of our friends join us. So maybe we'll start it in just one more minute. All right, we've hit 9:02, and in the interest of time, I'd like to get us going. I imagine people will keep joining along the way. So, welcome to the Low Carbon Fuels Policy Working Group. We appreciate you taking the time to contribute to this process and join us for our second meeting. My name is Michael Friels. I'm an analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm joined by a team of Odo staff here to support this meeting. So Jessica Rikers will be leading discussion, while also watching for raised hands or activity in the chat. Jillian DeMedio will help facilitate discussion and answer questions. Edith is sharing her screen and will help answer questions as well. And Josh Price is available for any technical assistance you may need. If you do run into any technical issues, please send a direct message to the chat to Josh, or if you can't do that, email him. Hopefully you receive some emails and have his address available. If not, we can put it in the chat. We have other Odo staff here as well to support this meeting and may jump in to help us answer questions as needed. So I'm going to talk through a few slides at a time and then pause to see if there are questions. So please raise your virtual hand if you have a question or a thought to contribute. We can also pose questions. You can also pose questions in the meeting chat along the way. And I do want to alert you to the fact that we are recording this public meeting. We've also recorded our previous meetings. So if you're unable to attend we're going to model breakout on the 31st, or our last meeting last week on Wednesday, those are both recorded and available on the Oregon Energy Strategy website. So please check those out, and maybe we'll throw some links in the chat on along the way so you can see where those are located. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? So at a high level, Odo's purpose. So the Oregon Department of Energy helps Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. So development of the Oregon Energy Strategy and the conversations we will have today are helping us shape an equitable and clean energy transition and balance the needs of all communities in Oregon. Could we go to the next slide, please? So here are a few pointers for how to navigate the WebEx platform that we're using. So if you look at the bottom bar of your screen, you should see the ability to mute or unmute yourself, turn it on and off your camera. So I will ask, if you're able to have your camera on, please do so during the meeting. I'd love to see you, see your reactions as we're talking about things and having great conversations. And please always keep yourself on mute while others are speaking. There is the ability to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, or click on a reaction to show support for something that was said. The chat function is to the right of your screen, and you can open that up and add questions or thoughts. Excuse me. If you're joining us as a member of the public and are not part of the working group, you won't be able to participate in the chat function, but we do have a public comment portal that is open on our webpage for this project, and we do welcome comments there. And that's open throughout this process. So if you ever have a comment or something you want to contribute to, please put it in there, and we take a look at all those. So if we go to the next slide. So we have a full schedule today. So for introductions, may I ask that everyone introduce themselves in the chat. So please include your name and affiliation so we can get a sense of who's here today. And even better, if you can share with us if you did something fun in the snow last week or just something fun over the last weekend. That would be great. Moving on to the next slide. So a reminder on the process that we're going through. So today we're in meeting 2. So we're working on filling out that second column today this is the fun part. So we're going to identify all the problems or challenges ahead and what we want to do. So in our next meeting, we'll start going into kind of talking about potential solutions. So we'll take the issue statements we come up with on the barriers or potential challenges, and then we'll start tying those to some strategies to overcome those barriers, some policy solutions at the next meeting. All right, so if we go to the next slide. So thank you for all the great modeling questions we got in our last meeting. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but I want you to hold on to those questions, ask them in our upcoming energy modeling office hours. So we've scheduled those. I mentioned those last week. Now we've got a schedule of them. And I also want you to, if you can, hold on to some of those questions and any additional questions that have come up along the way. And think about them in terms of how does that make you feel about the model, and how can we present that as a potential barrier or issue statement so we can use those today, but also hold on to those and go to the scheduled office hours with Jeremy Hargreaves, who is the modeler who presented last week on the 31st, and he led development of the energy model. The modeling office hours will be an informal environment, and it will be driven by questions from policy working group members. And so please come to the meetings with questions already in hand. And if you want to have specific questions to fuels, you'll notice that March 3rd meeting is going to be geared towards kind of fuel conversations, but you're welcome to attend any and all these meetings or not attend any of them. They are voluntary. I also want to highlight the March 13th event, where we've got an energy wallet, air quality, and geospatial mapping complementary analysis information session. It's a mouthful. And so that's March 13th. And so the office hours are voluntary, but we would like you to attend the March 13th meeting to really hear about kind of that additional analysis and take that into account when we're thinking of policy solutions within our groups. So you should see a calendar invite for that complementary analysis info session soon. All right, if we go to the next slide. So let's focus on what we're going to do today. So we'll continue the conversation about key findings from the modeling related to fuels and the paths they suggest we take to achieve our state decarbonization targets. We will review the modeling results. We'll talk about where we are today, kind of related to those modeling results, work together on a brainstorming activity to identify issues and barriers to those key findings. And we'll do that with each of the paths. So each of the 4 paths that we've been talking about. About halfway through, we're going to try to take a 10-minute break to give everybody a little bit of a rest and come back to it. And we'll do our best to be done by noon today. So before we dive into the discussion itself, I'm going to pass it over to Jessica Rikers, the Technology and Policy Team Manager, to give us some guidance on how best to engage during this meeting.
Hi, thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Nice to see you all here. Thank you for your time and just your general expertise as we head down this deep dive on low carbon fuels. So I'm here to help facilitate our group conversation today. And my main objective is to help ensure that Michael has robust input from all of you on the energy pathway options concerning fuel use in Oregon. To accomplish this, I just want to remind all of us on the group agreements we're using to encourage active engagement and discourse. First, it's important to recognize that we have a lot of different perspectives and areas of expertise in this group. And we will have some whiteboarding exercises where everyone will have the space to share their perspectives and expertise on the barriers that they see to achieving our state goals and objectives. But we'll also have some open conversation and dialogue where Odo can dig into more specifics and ask questions to better understand the barriers presented. And during these times, it's important to keep the conversations constructive and informative. And this may be challenging since there are not always going to be times when we all agree on things. But remember that we all have different experiences, perspectives, and expertise, and this could lead to differences in how we see barriers for different energy pathways. Let's also create space for everyone to offer their perspectives, seek to understand those perspectives, and offer differing perspectives in a respectful way. And finally, there's a lot to cover and limited time for conversation. So be as brief as possible and allow space for all members to provide input. So we really appreciate your investment of time, as I mentioned, to inform this work. And to that end, I'm going to share some basic guidance to help focus our conversations in a way that makes the best use of our collective time. The focus of today's meeting is on identifying barriers, specifically those related to fuel use in Oregon. And to do this, we are centering on the findings from the energy system modeling provided by our contractor. As a reminder, the model results are not to provide a specific future state, but rather provide us with valuable information about the effects of different energy policy actions on Oregon's economy. But remember, the model is only one set of information guiding our discussion. As you can see in the graphic on the right, which shows there are other considerations beyond our economy that can provide an important lens to understand barriers specific to specific policy actions. For example, how will different policy options affect consumer costs or local energy resilience? Are there differences in environmental justice or community goal outcomes with different options? You should consider all of these things as we engage in these discussions. We also expect and encourage different opinions on barriers. Where you see barriers differently than one of your working group colleagues, please speak up and do so in a respectful manner. And finally, try to stay focused on barriers today. I know it can be really challenging to not seek out solutions. And if solutions come up, we'll add them to a parking lot list for our next meeting. But today, the focus is going to be on getting a broad understanding of the challenges you and your organizations might face during an energy transition. And if you are a problem solver like me, the good news is that this will be the focus of our next meeting. So have some hope there. Before I pass it back to Michael to dive into one of our key findings, are there any questions about this approach that we're taking? All right, seeing none, keeping these things in mind, I'm going to pass it back to Michael, who's going to share some key findings from the model and get some group input.
Okay, so key field findings. We go to the next slide. Oh, great. So our policy conversations are organized by 4 high-level key field-related findings. So there's a growing need for low-carbon fuels. Fuels will need to provide capacity support for a growing electricity grid. Electrification is the least cost path for many current fuel applications. Fuel demand declines, but it's critical to maintaining our energy system. So if we go to the next slide, we'll first start with low carbon fuels are an increasing proportion of Oregon's energy supply across all scenarios. So the next slide. So as you can see in this chart, all scenarios show an increase in low carbon fuel demand by 2050. So the first column is 2024. And you can see that it's the estimated low carbon fuel consumption at that time. And then the other columns represent various scenarios with the estimated low carbon fuel use H1. So we're just showing the first 3 scenarios. The other additional 3 scenarios also are matched with where the reference is. So in the reference scenario, the low carbon fuels go from about 10% of total fuels consumed in 2024 to 94% of fuels consumed in 2050. So low carbon fuel demand is even higher in the delayed energy efficiency in building electrification and delayed transportation electrification scenarios. If there's less electrification of applications, then low carbon fuels are used to decarbonize fuel use. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the model shows a significant decline in fuel use in commercial and residential buildings, but the industrial and agricultural sectors retain most of their fuel use and transition to a variety of low carbon fuels. Most existing fuel applications in buildings are electrified, but it may not be technologically feasible or cost effective to do so in many industrial and agricultural applications. The model chose low carbon fuels as a solution in many of those cases. So if we go to the next slide, let's look at imported versus what's produced in Oregon as far as some of those fuels. So we look at the results of the model, and within it, you see on the chart on the left, just like fossil fuels now, most of the low carbon fuels in the model are imported into Oregon for use. Fuel imports decline as fuel use declines, but not much fuel is actually created in Oregon. In the chart on the right, you can see the in-state clean fuel growth that does happen in the model comes from direct use of hydrogen. So liquid low carbon fuels are assumed to be easier to import using existing distribution infrastructure and are imported from other states like they're done today. So notice how the modeling also shows a big jump in carbon fuels replacing fossil fuels from 2045 to 2050. All right, so let's go to the next slide and take a look at where we are today. So most low carbon fuels consumed in Oregon are consumed in the transportation sector. This chart shows the percentage of low carbon fuels consumed on Oregon roads in particular, and the percentage of low carbon fuels rose above 10% for the first time in 2022. So this chart actually starts in 2005, excuse me, and at that time, petroleum products like gasoline and diesel accounted for 98.8% of the fuel consumed on Oregon roads, while just 1.2% came from low carbon fuels. So consumption is growing, and this is largely attributable to Oregon's Clean Fuels Program and federal and state renewable fuel standards. And we're thinking about these low carbon fuels and how they're used. They're kind of categorized in a variety of different ways. So one category, we've got blended fuels. So fuels that are added to petroleum fuels to reduce emissions like ethanol or biodiesel. Another category is zero tailpipe emission fuels. So fuels that may not produce zero tailpipe emissions, though there may be emissions attributed to the production of that fuel, depending on how it's produced, like hydrogen, for example. And then another category would be renewable fuels, or a lower carbon intensity version of a commonly used petroleum fuel, like renewable diesel or renewable gasoline. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So we look at low carbon fuels we produce in Oregon today. So Oregon produces blended fuels, biodiesel, and ethanol, but has yet to see significant growth in in-state fuel production. So one fuel also that's not even represented here, but is an opportunity for Oregon, is renewable natural gas or biogas. So methane is captured from agricultural and municipal waste and wastewater, refined, stored, and then used as a natural gas. Renewable natural gas could power vehicles, can be blended into existing fossil gas lines, or used to make electricity, and Oregon has potential to invest in and produce more of it as a low carbon fuel. Okay, so let's look to the next slide. If we look at biofuels and kind of national biofuel production and supply, biofuel production is increasing, especially in the renewable diesel and other biofuels category. So that's that light green category kind of in the middle of the bar chart. So this includes renewable diesel fuel, renewable heating oil, sustainable aviation fuel, renewable gasoline, and other biofuels. So currently, Washington State has 2 plants, and California has 5 that can produce renewable diesel and other biofuels. At our last meeting, we spoke briefly about kind of renewable diesel's growing market share. I know, David, you highlighted the opportunity there, and renewable diesel is popular with fleet managers because it's a drop-in fuel. It requires no modifications to equipment for either storing or using the fuel. It's chemically identical to and can be used in 100% replacement for petroleum diesel, and it can go in any diesel engine and used in any weather. So it has a lot of appeal. And there's high demand for renewable diesel right now in Oregon, but limited supply. And it can be even more challenging to get in some of Oregon's rural communities. So it's important to keep that in mind. All right, let's go to the next slide. So hydrogen is another potential low carbon fuel opportunity for Oregon. The Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub is a collaboration between Oregon, Washington, and Montana to develop a clean hydrogen economy within the Northwest. The Hydrogen Hub was awarded federal funding and is still in the early planning stages, but 3 of the 8 Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub nodes are in Oregon and will include projects which accrete hydrogen through electrolysis, transport it through a pipeline, liquefy it, and store it in a liquefaction plant, and use it for both long-term energy storage and as zero-emission fuel for heavy-duty transportation. These projects are expected to accelerate deployment and drive down the cost of low-carbon hydrogen in Oregon. So they offer an exciting opportunity. Now, I will turn you over to Jessica to talk about key challenges within this space.
Thanks, Michael. So with what Michael showed you, we reviewed the findings of the model, and some high-level key challenges occurred to us around an increased adoption of low-carbon fuels. So first, we thought there would be many potential low-carbon fuel options, each with a different timeline for viability and commercial availability. And there are many different considerations for individuals, businesses, and industry before they could choose to adopt or use a lower carbon alternative, such as when to make that change and whether to phase in the new fuel or make a one-time change to that fuel. And investments in these new resources and technologies come with a lot of considerations like When will the fuel be available? And for some, when will the vehicles that use that fuel be available? What are the costs relative to other options? Or what are the costs and benefits of waiting to convert until cleaner fuels like hydrogen are available? These are really high level challenges. And our hope is that they will spark some thoughts on the challenges you and your organizations face, because we're about to start an activity to brainstorm around these issues. But before I do that, do you have any high level clarifying questions about the modeling results that Michael just presented? Or is there anything that you think is really glaringly missing from these key modeling takeaways that we put up on the screen, keeping in mind limited time and the more important pieces to make sure that you'll have time to give your more specific barriers and issues? All right, Brian, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I guess a few questions that I have regarding the modeling and the discussion around clean fuels is, it seems like the model in the state has already made the determination that hydrogen is the solution of choice for clean fuels. And I'm curious, in the prior slides, we stated that we weren't going to focus on the solutions, but more on the goals. And I'm curious why we've elected to use hydrogen as a preference from a solution standpoint versus other, maybe more beneficial and cost-effective clean fuels for an option.
That's a great question. I'll just start, and then Michael, feel free to jump in. I don't think that it's been chosen by the model. It was what the model found to be the least cost solution with the information that we have today. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and we'll hit on that a little bit later in some of the other key findings. So where I'd like to focus attention around that is, if that's going to be a potential option for the future, what are some of the challenges and barriers associated with that? And I think I'm hearing from you that uncertainty around whether that will be the fuel of choice when we get out into that far late 2030s and 2040s is a barrier or an issue. So I would just flag that as something that we would want to hear from all of you about what your thoughts are around the viability of hydrogen in the future. And Michael, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you got it. Yeah, the modeling chose hydrogen, but that's the kind of limitation of the model. It chose that, but we don't necessarily have to follow it. It's really, as Jessica pointed out, the challenge before us is kind of how do we vet those opportunities and evaluate them for the future, and what should the state invest in and at what level?
Thanks, Brian. I see next up, Charla has her hand raised. Charla, are you?
Two screens going here and couldn't remember where to unmute. So yeah, I think that helped me. What Michael just said was useful. So what, in terms of just the state investment, I just want to understand what you're thinking that means. Is that incentives, or when you talk about how do we determine the best low carbon fuel options and what to invest in? What kind of investment are we talking about? Is the state talking about? Is it things like incentives?
Well, at this point, we don't really know. I guess once we get to those potential policy solutions, that might be something we discuss. What level would it be, incentives, or would it be something else? But right now, we're going to try to identify the barriers. So we'll kind of list all the different barriers, and then in the next meeting, we'll say, okay, we've identified these specific barriers to where we want to get to. What would that look like? What would a solution look like? And it could be incentives, it could be other policy changes, it could be education. There's a variety of different issues, and we'll have to kind of balance what the best way to do that and be fiscally responsible, and what we can actually accomplish as a state.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. I see Dave and John have your hands up, and I just want to indicate that we do want to be conscientious of time, because the real need of this is getting to the exercise that Michael has planned. So unless there's any other burning questions, I'd like to hold at that. And Dave, go ahead and jump on.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to second that earlier comment about, it's not really seconding, it's to me, one of the biggest barriers in this process is the modeling, and it's the amount of information that has available to it, and its attempt to kind of pick, the one answer, hydrogen, as was discussed, as opposed to looking at what I think the reality is going to be, which is going to be all of the above, all these different fuels playing roles in terms of moving towards a zero carbon future. And so for example, in the slide showing what's being produced in Oregon, it's just got a flat line going out. I think it was out indefinitely. And that doesn't track, I think, reality or what's likely to happen in Oregon as we move into this low carbon future. So if there's a way to and then the second point is to me that this is looking kind of jumping ahead to 2040, 2050 for a zero carbon future. And I don't think it adequately is looking at what are we doing between now and 2035 in terms of reducing GHG emissions in the low carbon fuel sector. And obviously, hydrogen isn't the main player in that shorter term period. It's going to be renewable diesel and other fuels. So just wanted to highlight that, what I think is a big barrier in terms of the thing. And I'm hoping that we can think of how to approach from a low carbon fuel perspective the shorter term components as well as the longer term.
That's great, David. I think we're in alignment, and that's a great transition to our activity of kind of identifying those barriers. You're certainly right. There are limitations to the model and the data available today and what the model will choose. And so really we're now at the stage of saying, okay, that the model's interesting, but now let's look at the reality. And you kind of pointed out what would be created in Oregon versus imported to the state, and maybe there's a great opportunity there. And maybe that's something that when we're looking at the barriers, we look at specifics of like what would it look like to have production within the state, and how to highlight those opportunities for economic benefit and the benefit of having those fuels and other reasons. So I think that's a great transition for us to kind of move into our barrier identification activity. So I believe that you've gotten a link from Josh in the chat. Oh, there it is right there. So if you click on this is going to take you to a Miro board, and we're going to use that. And there's some sticky notes that we will use on the Miro board to kind of put our issue statements or list our barriers. So if everybody could go to that, that would be wonderful. And Josh is going to kind of share his screen. So if we could move down, so we're actually going to start with the second one down on the board, low carbon fuel development. And so our question is, what are the primary issues or barriers to increasing low carbon fuel demand and production? So if you haven't used Miro before, what we're going to do is we're going to create these little sticky notes, these little boxes. And how to create a sticky note, you can see there's a couple, it looks like we've got a couple of green ones there just to the left of the main category boxes. And you can grab one of those and type in it. Or if you look on the left-hand part of your screen, it looks like it's the my screen, what is it? The fourth one down. If you click on that, you can grab a sticky and you can pick a color. The colors don't matter. You pick whatever color you want. And ideally, what you're doing is taking that sticky, writing a barrier or issue, and putting it in one of the appropriate categories within low carbon fuel development. So hopefully everybody's getting in this. So we have, within low carbon fuel development, we have a category of supply, demand, feedstock, and cost affordability. We also have other. So if you have a barrier issue, kind of fit in those categories. There's also a parking lot over to the right. So maybe you have something that's not directly a barrier or something specific to low carbon fuel development, but a statement or a question you want to ask or something you want to table and bring up at some point, and we can put it over in the parking lot and address it there.
Hey, Michael.
So what? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I apologize for jumping in, but I'm getting a notification from a couple folks that the link is not working for them. And so I just want to make sure that we don't move too far until Josh is able to help get people into the Miro.
Okay.
And it looks like he just still indicating that we're having some problems for folks getting into the Miro.
Yeah, I think the link ID isn't copying over as part of the link.
Ah, okay. You might try copying the whole link.
Unfortunately, you can't Oh, maybe you
Oh,
can't.
no.
You can't quite copy it out of the chat. It tries to copy the entire chat board.
Okay, Kara said she was able to copy and paste it.
I just have to be patient and go scroll down to copy it.
All right, thanks for everybody's patience as we figure this out. Well, as we're getting people to join, I guess maybe I'll just kind of talk about the brainstorming, kind of the format, so people can kind of listen to that as we're getting set up. So what we're going to do is you've got the question, you've got the categories and sticky notes, and we're going to pause or give everybody 5 minutes of quiet time to start writing, identifying some of those issues and putting them in the box. And then after the 5 minutes, we'll come together as a group and kind of a discussion on what we're seeing. You can continue to add stickies and please do so along the way, but then we're going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes based on the time we have available about what we're seeing and maybe get some feedback and talk through the kind of the process. So when you're writing stickies, think about in terms of how specific you can be in talking about kind of policy challenges. So the more specific you can be, the more helpful it's going to be. And we're going to take these policy challenges we're identifying today and try to take them and look at policy solutions next time. All right. Are we getting most of the people in here?
I'm hearing some success stories in the chat. If
Okay.
you're still struggling with the different options that are available to get in, please send a note in the chat and we'll work to get you in there.
Okay, it looks like Josh has started our clock, so we're at 4 minutes. I'll let you know we've got about a minute left, so please continue to add sticky notes on the board.
Michael, we're getting some feedback that folks are a little confused on how to operate the board. And I just want to flag for folks, once you're in, you can click on one of the sticky notes that you see off to the left-hand side. And if you double click in there, you can start writing. And then you can actually click on it and drag it into the different areas that you think your barrier might fit into. So if it's a supply issue, you can throw it in there. If it's a cost or affordability issue, you can throw it in there. And I do recognize that sometimes these things cross different areas, and in which case feel free to throw it in other instead of having to figure out which specific place it might belong in.
I will also highlight in the bottom right-hand corner, you can zoom in or zoom out, and that may be helpful to adjust for people. I know it certainly helps me. And I do want to highlight, so we are working on the low carbon fuel development. So what are the primary issues or barriers to increasing low carbon fuel demand and production? So that's the second one down. So if you could focus on answering that question at this time. Okay, looks like we've got about 40 seconds left. We might give you a little bit extra time because we were still trying to figure everything out. But I do want to highlight being as specific as we can. So instead of just saying 1 or 2 word answer, we want to make sure we build out what the specific issue is so we can address it. Specificity will be really helpful as we're trying to figure out solutions. So we want to be really specific with what the barriers are, the challenges are. Charlotte, I saw the note you were having a challenge writing in sticky notes. Would you like to say something and have one of us draft a sticky note for you or a couple? All right, Charlotte, I'm going to check in one more time and see. Would you like some assistance with getting a sticky note on? Okay, well, it looks like we've got lots of good sticky notes on here, so enough to start a conversation, but please don't stop adding ideas or thoughts or building out the ideas more as we're having this discussion or things come to your mind. I also want to highlight this isn't the only opportunity. I know everything is going to be going really fast. We're trying to do a lot in the 3 hours we have here today. So you're welcome to send me an email with additional thoughts or additional barriers that you may think of, whether it's after this meeting you think of other things or just it gives you more time to articulate your thoughts, please send them to me and I can certainly add them to the board. And then we will take those barriers and work off them to come up with solutions next time. Jessica, do you want to lead us in discussion?
Yeah, and I see that Brian has his hand raised, so I thought I would start off by opening up the floor to him, see if he's got questions or comments he wants to make.
I apologize. That was previous when I was having issues
Oh.
with the micro application. So no questions at this point.
Okay, great. All right, so I see that there's a big sticky note in supply around cost, and it gets me kind of curious what the concerns are on cost as it pertains to supply. So if the person who added that wants to provide some more context, that would be great. Or if anybody wants to jump in around supply side costs, that would be, I think, useful for the conversation. And I see Antonio, who had wanted to speak previously, has his hand up now. So for that cost question, I'll put it on pause. So if you want to think about what you might want to add to that, let's go over to Antonio and see what his question or comment is.
Oh, it's related to that, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss this. Antonio Machado here with WISPA, and really, we're trying to come up with barriers, right? And our understanding is that as other states also increase their low carbon fuels and their demand for them, the supply, unfortunately, Oregon does not have you know, does not have, for example, refineries or big production facilities. So 90% of the fuels that come into Oregon are imported, and this probably is a big barrier because as other states increase their low carbon fuel demand, there's going to be competition, which will most definitely increase cost, making it very difficult for everyone to be able to afford if there's a big ask or demand for low carbon fuels in a short period of time. So what we have seen is that in order for us to transition to a different source of energy, there has to be a greater availability of every single fuel so that then everybody can prepare and have the energy necessary for the transition. So definitely the competition with other states when it comes to low carbon fuels. And for example, if I was Oregon, I would be watching very carefully what Washington is trying to do, because if they are trying to lower the CI, and then we get to a point where if we convert everything to renewable diesel, gasoline cannot be converted so much more than what ethanol can give us. So we need to understand that if states like Washington or California were to go higher, then the demand is going to change in the price, and that will affect a state like Oregon that does not have in-state facilities that produce this.
Thanks, Antonio. I heard potentially a few barriers in there. One is that, we're going to be competing for fuels that are in high demand in other states as well, which could potentially lead to higher costs. And I also heard that there's a barrier concerning, in particular, gasoline, because there aren't any existing options to really replace gasoline at this moment other than electrification. Is that a fair assessment of what I just said?
That would be fair. Well, where ethanol is the only thing that we can add to gasoline to lower, the CI or the impact that it has when it comes to carbon emissions. So unless we come up with a different technology, it's difficult. Diesel, we probably can, although I can foresee that if all the states around us go to renewable diesel and we go to 99% renewable, there's going to be more demand than supply, which will also increase cost and affordability, right?
Yeah.
And there's going to be an imbalance when it comes to availability of fuels, of cheap fuels, and that, of course, brings the injustice part into play. But I'll stop right there and let other people comment, unless you have some questions.
Thanks, Antonio. I appreciate the input, and that was a really nice overview. So I see, Tim, I just want to note, I see your hand raised, and I just want to comment that Michael Graham added to the chat that there's a barrier to higher ethanol blend to displace gasoline use, is that the vehicles themselves can't handle a higher ethanol blend. So there's another barrier there, which is just the vehicles. Even if we could do higher blends, we can't, the vehicles won't take it. And then Tim, is your hand up to respond to something Antonio said, or is this a topic change?
Same topic.
Same topic. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, I was intrigued by Antonio's comment, and I think it's an important one, but I wanted to just understand how, Antonio, how you're thinking about the state by state sort of competition versus just a market here where, if we have more demand, that typically drives costs up, and typically that inspires more people to supply. And are you seeing portability of these products as a barrier? Like if we have high demand here and high demand in other states, do we have to have in-state supply? Is that what you're suggesting? Or I mean, I'm having trouble tracking the state by state comment with respect to supply and demand in a market where products move. Certainly, we're going to have some in-state, or at least we hope to. But I'm just trying to understand that a little better, Antonio, and get at your really good point about cost.
Yeah, very good. Absolutely. So we do have, when it comes to liquid fuels, we have two main sources, right? We have what we call fossil fuels, and if we had a free market, the fossil fuels, that is more abundant, right? When it comes to the raw material, which is crude. When it comes to renewable fuels, we're talking about more of a limited raw material availability, and then we depend on fats, oils, and greases, right? And there is a certain amount of those available. The plants that produce these are not very many. They're developing more and more, and I know that some of our members, WISPA members, they have facilities that have converted completely from fossil fuels to renewables, and but it's a very intricate, very difficult to explain process, but the raw material, we can produce it in-house, basically the United States, but also a lot of it comes from outside the United States. And if we consider that there's going to be more demand on that raw material, but there's also going to be tariffs and stuff like that, there's so many things that play right now that basically will make the demand from each state, and also the rules and laws that they implement, forcing people to require it, which is going to definitely go to where the market is actually paying for it. And the problem that I foresee is that the fuels are going to be available to those that can pay for it. And for example, a good example is EV vehicles. If we do or if we try to understand the annual income of people that own EV vehicles, that will give us a good understanding of who are driving the EV vehicles, right? And in this case, I think that as we see other states pushing for low carbon fuels with a limited source, and for stringent and collapsing the amount of time of transition, then there's going to be a spike when it comes to affordability. And that's my view on things, based on the behaviors that we see, and the logistics, and how the dynamics of the traditional fuels work. But there are limits when it comes to gasoline. We can only, as somebody mentioned, it's a framework of the cars cannot take more than 10% of ethanol into it, so we're capped there. And if we go with 99% or 100% on the diesel side, then that creates somewhat of a limit.
Thanks, Antonio. I appreciate it. We're running short on time, but Tim, did you have any follow-up to that? And then I'm going to pass it over to Michael. Michael, you put your hand down.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Michael, last opportunity. Is there anything you wanted to join and chime in with before we'll move on to the next topic?
Yeah, I was starting to just type it out. The barrier that I think is being alluded to is just the changes in state level credit prices, and how that like in the Clean Fuels program, and how that drives supply of renewable diesel. The producers of renewable diesel send their product to the states with some of the strongest credit prices. So California's is around $73, Oregon's is around $75, Washington's is around $15 currently. Washington Oregon gets most of our fuel supply from Washington, right? And Washington is currently proposing a new bill that would strengthen the clean fuel standard in Washington, that would have secondary impacts or effects of supporting a stronger credit price. So I guess the question that's being raised is, if Washington has a stronger credit price and more of their production of renewable diesel stays in state, what happens to Oregon's supply?
Great, thank you. That was excellent context. Very much appreciated. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next topic and hand things back to Michael. Michael, in this case, Michael Frills. But I just want to mention that this is, as Michael pointed out, this isn't the end of this. There are going to be many other opportunities to provide feedback around the barriers and challenges. And then Michael will do a wrap up at the end, but we're going to take the information that you've provided here and use that to help inform the next meeting that we have with this working group. So that's how this information is going to be used in the next steps. So that is it from me for this key finding. Thanks, everybody. And Michael, back to you.
Yeah, Edith, can you take us back to the presentation, please? So we're going to get into our next key takeaway, focusing on firm dispatchable resources that are needed to support the growing electric grid. So if we go to the next slide, the modeling found the total amount of fuels used to generate electricity decreases over time. So as you can see that chart on the left, that panel A, but the need for firm on-demand resource will be critical for resilience, safety, and to support the growing electricity grid. So if you look at the chart on the right, in this visual, the model's assessing Oregon's capacity to generate electricity from gaseous fuels through 2050 in the reference scenario. So the dark columns represent existing electricity generation capacity from natural gas, which we retain most of over time. But starting in 2035, there's a significant increase in low carbon fuel capacity needed. So in the model, this new capacity is powered by biogas or hydrogen. So flexible capacity is needed to make sure the system stays reliable, safe, and we value that flexible capacity even more as the electricity system grows. So in the model, the new firm on-demand resources are sited in the western region of the state near the greatest load centers. So gas fuel plants are selected in the model because they're the least cost option to provide flexibility and reliability, and that's based on data available today, so that may change over time. And these fuel resources are used infrequently, likely for only a few hours in the year, reducing overall fuel consumption. Imagine periods of low renewable electricity output or high demand or low hydro conditions. All these things would drive the need for these resources. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, these visuals demonstrate the results of scenario 6 in the model. So scenario 6 is the alternative flexible resources scenario. It's where we tested the value of dispatchable resources by restricting the ability of Oregon to add new clean gas electricity growth. So what we found in the model is that when we restrict those gas resources to be built, the model built more renewable electricity generating capacity in the eastern part of the state and greater transmission to the western part. So if you look at the chart on the right, if you start at the 0 line right in the middle of that chart, everything to the right in this scenario is added capacity, and everything to the left is what isn't built. So to the left, you can see that those clean gas resources, that capacity isn't built. So then everything to the right is built. And so over to the right, you see more renewable energy generation. You see some electricity storage. You see utility scale solar, some more onshore wind, and some geothermal. But on the left is that additional gas plants that aren't built in this scenario. So in this scenario, it's interesting because electricity generating capacity isn't consistently needed by demand of Oregon West. So if you build this additional capacity over the right, you build those additional renewable electricity generation facilities. Because it's not constantly needed, the model actually uses it to produce hydrogen from electrolysis. And Oregon then uses the hydrogen within the state and exports it to other Western states. So in this scenario, Oregon becomes actually an exporter of hydrogen, produces a lot more of it as a result. So if we go to the next slide, if we look at how what electricity generation kind of looks like in the state today, kind of comparison to that model. So Oregon generates electricity from a variety of resources, hydropower being the biggest, but also natural gas and wind are also pretty large. And so Oregon has 16 natural gas electricity generation facilities today, and nearly all the natural gas used to generate electricity in Oregon is imported. So Oregon's last coal-fired power plant, the Boardman facility, closed in October 2020. So we don't produce any electricity from coal at any time. We do import electricity from coal. and renewable natural gas or biogas could be collected and combusted to make electricity and to serve on-site needs or to be sold to utilities. But there are not many facilities doing that in Oregon at this point, but it's a greater potential resource. So certainly want to flag that. And if we look at this generation over time, if you go to the next slide, you can see the rise of natural gas and wind as resources. So hydro is that blue level at the top that fluctuates year to year. And then you see red is the natural gas and how that's increased over time, as well as the orange wind has also increased. So considering that we use natural gas in the hydro system as kind of our primary options to balance renewable resources today, and also thinking in mind that it's probably unlikely that we'll add new large hydro to be built. So gas turbines are kind of the primary option to provide grid reliability going into the future. So I will pause there and turn this over to Jessica to talk about kind of the key challenges within this group.
Hey, thanks, Michael. Appreciate the introduction that you've provided to everybody here. So I've lost my talking points. Here we go. So as we look at the modeling here concerning the reliability of our electric sector, a few things kind of rose to the top for us as far as what the model results were telling us. The modeling scenarios indicate that the least cost option to meet our decarbonization goals includes some amount of additional gas electricity generation capacity. And although more capacity is needed, the model found that these would be operated infrequently, primarily to meet seasonal peak load events such as heat waves or cold snaps, which means that overall fuel use continues to decline over the modeling timeframe. But right now, existing data points to the two primary fuels for clean generation being biofuels or hydrogen. And again, that's right now as using the data that's available today. These are things that are far into the future that could change as we get more information and data around these fuels. So before we jump into our brainstorming exercises, I'll ask my usual question again of if there are any high-level clarifying questions about the modeling results for Michael, or is there anything that's missing that's a really high-level key modeling takeaway before we dive into the whiteboarding exercise again? There's a question from Kara in the chat, Michael, which is how the modeling considered storage. Electric investor and utilities are investing in batteries to help with reliability and to reduce generation relying on fossil fuels.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Kara. If we could actually go back up both slides, you can see they're actually in that alternative scenario, you could see a little bit of battery generation. Especially in this alternative scenario as kind of a replacement. I believe it's the green kind of at the end of that utility solar in that visualization to the right. And it did select a little bit of battery storage, but we didn't see as much as we kind of thought there might be. And so that's something for us to certainly consider and talk about. I think it's just a fact of it being expensive at this time, and maybe that will evolve over time. We'll see more of that. But a lot of the battery storage is kind of short duration. And we're trying to think of like long duration storage for some of these options. So we'll kind of balance that, but that might be something we identify in the barriers, kind of talking about the role of batteries and how that might change over time. It's a good thing to highlight.
Can I just jump in? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just want to jump in real quick because I'm remembering that we asked our modeler this question, and I just wanted to share an insight that he shared with us about the batteries, which is that it's only cost effective to invest in that battery if you run it often. And what we're talking about here is something that's not run often. And so the way that the costs sugar out, it's the way that these gas plants are, relatively speaking, they're not that expensive to build. It's the fuel that's that high cost, but you don't use that fuel very often. And so those were kind of the economics behind why this ended up being the solution. It really has to do with the infrequency of this of this reliability need on the system. These aren't even peakers. These are really stepping in, as Jessica said, for like reliability purposes during extreme weather events, low hydro year, low renewables output, that kind of situation.
Then Edith, one question based on your explanation there, super helpful, thank you. You said built. Are we not talking about using existing thermal plants and just dropping in fuel or retrofitting them to adapt to fuel? In other words, do the costs include the need to build the thermal plant?
So Michael, do you want to answer that? I just scrolled up to the slide that I think helps answer the question.
Yeah, so we would retain our existing plants. So you see that in those columns, that dark gray. So those are our existing gas generation plants. So we've got those 16 around the state. So those, for the most part, would stay. The volume that they're actually producing would go down significantly over time. But we would actually add the additional facilities as Edith was just talking about, and those would be added in the model in the western region of the state. But this is all things to take in context of just kind of like the model is kind of like the perfect scenario. And so utilities in their IRP planning might be a little bit different because it's not necessarily a perfect system, and they recognize that there's big changes, and they may need short-term storage and long-term storage and a variety of different options along the way. And so there are a variety of different like reliability concerns and issues around that. And so that kind of feeds us right into the barrier conversation and what issues there might be, and around kind of siting these facilities, the likelihood we think that they would get sited and we would use them this way.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. And I see Tim's hands up. I also just want to jump in really quickly because David Vantoff posted in the chat that there really are two types of reliability needs, short-term and long-term, which Michael covered. But I do want to clarify one thing about the model, which is the model doesn't prefer hydrogen or prefer low-cost fuels. The model selects the resources needed based on the cost information that we have today. And that's where the model landed. I think it indicates that there's some uncertainty around that right now. And certainly those cost estimates for far-reaching future fuels like hydrogen and low carbon fuels like biogas, there's still a lot to learn and understand about what those costs might be. So just to clarify how the model operates in that respect. So I'm going to move.
Jessica,
Yes.
I just wanted to add one more thing to that, which is the model actually is solving for two things. It's solving to meet our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and least cost to meet those goals. So it's doing both at the same time, which is why you see alternative fuels show up in the model as the least cost option.
And by way of introduction, just in case you aren't familiar, I'm sure you are by now, Edith Bear, who spoke earlier, is the lead for the Energy Strategy Project. And Alan Zelenka, who was just speaking, is the Assistant Director at Oddo for Planning and Innovation. And this project is under his purview. So just so folks know who's talking right now. But I do see Tim's hand up, so I wanted to give him an opportunity to talk, and then I'm going to move us into the brainstorming exercise. If other questions come up or things you want to talk about, hold on to them because we will get to a chat at the end of this.
Thanks, Jessica. If I'm tracking the slides correctly, the scenario without as much build out of these short use gas plants has a ton of renewables being built, and those renewables are mainly for electrolysis to create hydrogen. If I'm understanding what Michael was saying correctly, I'm just curious on this uncertainty point you have here on this slide. Do we believe the model has completely or accurately built in all the infrastructure costs around a hydrogen economy, moving it around, pipes? We don't have distribution systems. All that is I'm just a little concerned that the model might be based on, well, here's how much a hydrogen plant will cost with a cost curve, but does it have all the infrastructure built into the costs?
So Tim, it does use the cost data that we get from NREL, and so the intention is for it to be comprehensive. But I think what you're highlighting is it's a nascent nascent technology, nascent fuel, and so there's a lot of some unknowns or some assumptions around it. I know electrolysis, in particular, there were a lot of forecasting initially that was going to be a lot cheaper at this time, but that hasn't been achieved yet. And so we don't really know. And I know Rebecca Smith's here, and she can provide some insight to us as we're looking at those barriers. But I think what you're highlighting is a variety of different barriers that even not even thinking about the modeling, but thinking about going forward, that we should certainly highlight to kind of technologies that are relatively new, and how much should be invested, or what other opportunities should be evaluated as well.
Yeah, I'm just saying the cost of electrolysis is one
Yeah.
thing, but the cost of the infrastructure required for a hydrogen economy is another layer that I just not sure it's in there. Maybe it is. That'd be great. I'm not against that transition in any way. I'm just wanting to be sure that the model is selecting correctly with all the build out of infrastructure. Thanks.
Sure. I would just highlight that I think the intention of the model was to capture all the infrastructure costs of hydrogen, but I think within the barriers you could highlight your concerns around that. I think you can actually articulate that really well as different barriers and things that we need to consider as well as policy. So I think that's a great flag. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. And I'll just add that Charlotte added to the comments that she's also wondering about the cost of permitting as well. Was that included? And Michael Graham added the cost of pipeline infrastructure to distribute the clean hydrogen, and that might be needed to power the power plants at scale. So Michael, do you have anything you want to add to that, those two things, or we can work on getting answers to those after this meeting?
Yes, I guess I would say that I think these are all great barriers. And so I actually kind of want to move us forward. Like, I mean, we can kind of ground and be interested in the model, but I think what you're all highlighting are these great barriers that we need to, within this activity, start identifying and saying, okay, well, the model is interesting, but here's the reality, and here's all these different barriers that I foresee. And I think that's great, and that's what we want to do. So I guess I would move us from this key challenges and into the activity and just start putting those in stickies, and kind of move forward with that and not worry about the modeling results, because that's all theoretical, and the reality is a lot of these things are kind of new, and that I think you guys have got it. You've already started to identify all these barriers that we just need to list. So with that, Jessica, should we move back to the Miro board?
Yeah, and before you do that, I just want to encourage folks, if you're struggling with the use of the Miro board, which I totally agree, it's got some really great functionalities, the Miro board, but it can be a little non-intuitive. So you have other options to help engage in all of this, which is you can send the entire group or just to me your thoughts on what stickies you want to put in, and I'll make sure they get into the board. You can come off mute and just speak them out loud, and we'll add them to the board as you're talking. We want to make sure that everybody feels like they can participate. So use the different options available to you if working the board is just not happening right now.
Yeah, and Josh, thanks for sharing your screen. So we are going to focus on what we're just talking about, the dispatchable resources to support the electric grid. So what are the primary issues or barriers to using fuels as a dispatchable resource for electricity generation? So we've got four different categories: siting facilities, costs, community environmental impact, and other. And we've got the parking lot over the right for other things that just don't fit within that. So please start drafting stickies. We'll again start the timer and give you 5 minutes of kind of quiet time to start putting stickies in, and then we will have a discussion and dig into this a little bit more. All right, thank you. Okay, we're at our 5 minute mark. I apologize. I said I was going to give you a 1 minute warning and I totally failed on doing that this time. I'll try to remember next time. Uh, and I also wanted to clarify a point where we're talking about hydrogen and the scenario 6, that alternative. I know Tim, you're asking kind of questions about it. In that alternative, I believe that a lot of that generation happens in the eastern part of the state, and the electricity, you saw kind of the growth in transmission. Electricity is generated on the eastern part of the state and then is transmitted to the western part, where that electricity, that additional electricity, could be used to make hydrogen that's used for storage. That electricity directly goes to industry, and industry on site produces hydrogen that they use. If you remember seeing kind of that transition of hydrogen or industry using a lot more low carbon fuels, so that could be an avenue for industry, or electricity could go somewhere else and produce hydrogen. So in many cases, you may be able to avoid some of those infrastructure costs, whether it's pipelines or the cost of trucking, because electricity itself is what's getting transmitted, and then that hydrogen is made on site for use there. But again, this is within the model and kind of theoretical. And I am just talking about the no gas generation alternative scenario, not necessarily the reference scenario. And I guess I will also highlight that scenario is significantly more expensive to do economy-wide than the reference scenario. All right, Jessica, do you think we're ready for discussion?
Yeah, I think so. I indicated in the chat, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to raise your hand or throw items into the chat. Either way, I'll be watching both. I kind of wanted to build off of what Michael just said and throw out a overarching question for the group based on a comment that Brian had in the chat, which is, it seems like a lot of the comments and the barriers that I'm seeing here have to do with sort of the uncertainty and the potential for some of the costs that are taken into consideration in the model today, which is based on the best information that we had, might be, excuse me, might be a concern, and that we might be using this information to make develop policy actions or recommendations that wouldn't that could potentially change, that the information might not be fully fleshed out at this point. So I wanted to throw out there, would that potentially indicate for folks something along the lines of a barrier that indicates we need to do a deeper dive around the costs of some of these far future fuels to understand more about what all of the costs are that are entailed, which costs are more certain and which costs are less certain, those kinds of things. So there's a barrier of just having solid enough information to really make some good, solid choices with. How do people feel about that? Would that be a general agreement? Or do folks feel like there's more information available than what we had access to? And I see Brittany has her hand up. Brittany.
Yeah, I have a comment there that I put in the barriers as well. So in general, we don't know exactly what's going to happen as far as like costs for different technologies, like, 20 years down the line, et cetera. And so something that we recommend is creating policy that allows for some flexibility. Instead of like describing how we're going to decarbonize, maybe setting goals for decarbonization and leaving that to the market to kind of decide what is the lowest cost resource. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Brittany. I appreciate that input. I will, and I feel for you in what I'm about to say, that is getting into solutions territory. But we'll put it in the parking lot. We're going to get there. Thank you, though. And then I see Brian has his hand up. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And I want to be conscious. I don't want to take up too much time and be too loud of a voice here. I do sit on the advisory committee and understand a lot of limitations we had with the modeling, just from a cost perspective and the different scenarios that went into it. So I don't want to overstate or over kind of disagree with the modeling or what's taking place, but I do think that there are other solutions that we should be taking into consideration in this breakout group and working session that we couldn't reflect in the model because of some of the limitations that we had on the different scenarios that we could be used. So I do want to apologize. I don't want to feel like I'm beating the drum here against the state or the push that we're doing. I am very supportive of it. I just think that there's discussions that need to be had in this group as alternatives to the hydrogen solution.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that context. And I'll just add to that, which is just keep in mind that the model is not setting a future state for us in any way, shape, or form. It's meant to provide information. And where that information might be uncertain or there's more questions that arise around it, I think that's a really important point to make and to be considered as we're thinking through what some of these barriers are to achieving our end goals, which is really the focus of this group's work.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Jessica, but I do just think by the nature of the way the modeling had to be done, it did have a bias or did take into consideration hydrogen as the alternative fuel. And to kind of Brittany's point, I think finding the solution from a cost perspective and from an environmental impact perspective, we really didn't have the latitude to consider some of those other options because of limitations in the model. And so therefore hydrogen was the one that was selected and seems to be the focus on this particular working group and as the selection of the clean fuels.
Great feedback. So maybe if I can encourage a little bit of moving away from hydrogen. And I say that because the hydrogen is really something that's far out into the modeling future. And it does have other options available to it, low carbon fuels like renewable natural gas, for example. And maybe see if there's more questions or interest in comments around things that are other fueling options like biofuels that weren't addressed in the modeling or that people have some concerns around barriers to assessing those types of fuels in lieu of hydrogen. Or is everybody just really excited about talking about hydrogen? Maybe that's it. I think that oh, yes. I see a hand raised. Go for it.
Okay, I'll go again. One other barrier that I think it's important to bring up, and I think some of the other utilities on this call will probably agree in this, is one of the barriers we have is cost certainty or cost recovery certainty as a utility. We want to invest into renewables, but we don't have any clarity on if we can get rate recovery from those investments. So that's one of the big barriers for us on making progress.
That's an excellent barrier to reflect. I appreciate it. And thank you, Brittany, for jumping in. I see that there are hands raised. I swear, Rebecca Smith, I'm going to call on you now that it just showed up that you had your hand raised for me. So I apologize about that. But Rebecca, please jump in.
No worries. And thank you, Jessica. And, you know, I think that I guess this is a larger comment and question that includes hydrogen, but other solutions as well. And that is that I guess my understanding of this whole process, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we want to better understand what the various trade-offs are associated with all of these options, because there's no one right true path. It's all comes down to what's most important to us. If cost above all is most important, then great. The model can easily spit out some answers, but that's not going to be the case. And so I guess my question is how best to incorporate some of those other trade-offs that maybe the model doesn't address that well. I know that we've got the alternate analyses to help with that, with Energy Wallet and other things, but I guess what I'm looking for are, you know, if anyone has any suggestions for constructive ways to include that in our discussion here, because I do think that thinking about and talking about those trade-offs is important, and trying to find ways to include that in our discussions that then go to the policy recommendations.
I think that's a great point that you made, Rebecca, and you you actually absolutely nailed what the intent is behind all of this work. So I'll build off of that and say Way back when we first started this meeting, I covered sort of like some guiding principles around what we want to talk about in the meeting today that would be most effective. And I indicated that the modeling results are one piece of information or data to inform this discussion, but they're not the only one. There's also considerations around energy resiliency. There are considerations around costs to communities and costs to, in particular, ratepayers and low-income fuel users. There are concerns and interests around the environmental effects of different policy choices that are out there. And so all of those things are potential options for barriers that might come up that you might want to add into this discussion. And in particular, hydrogen is such a far-reaching nascent technology. I think we'd be really interested in what barriers folks are seeing around how we can reduce emissions in our fuel use in the early time frame. Now, I recognize that's challenging in this key area because we're talking about electric grid and dispatchable resources, which is not going to happen until later in the modeling time frame. But what are some of the near-term decisions that people might want to make around these future state fuels? And what are some of the questions that people have? Maybe we don't even think about it as barriers. We think about it as questions that people have around the different fuels to better understand what that policy future might look like. Or I'm sorry, what that energy future might look like, policy on the brain. So if I can flag that question for folks and see if anybody has any input. John, I see your hand up and I will come to you momentarily, and you'll be our last question/comment for this activity. Okay, food for thought then. I'll let that question hang and you guys can think about that more in the interim. And I will go to John. John has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I think with respect to your question on, other sort of short-term solutions for energy production, I think one of the things that we think is kind of missing from this mapping exercise is understanding the value of RNG as a feedstock for transportation fuels. Both renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel are able to be made in significant volumes from RNG. And so, considering RNG as an electricity source, I appreciate is an easy solution for power generation, but for hard to decarbonize sectors, RNG is one of the only local or regionally produced clean waste-based biogenic feedstocks for use into a transportation fuel. And I would just encourage that to be better understood and incorporated into the thinking. As of right now, it just shows as an energy source for electricity, and I think that's not the highest and best use case for RNG.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that input. Let's focus in on that a little bit. We've got like maybe 60 seconds, 120 seconds here. What are some of the barriers around renewable natural gas and the challenges of learning more about that as a fuel option in the future?
If Sam Wade's still on, I think it'd be great to hear from him as the RNG Coalition's thinking about this. But, for example, including RNG as a feedstock under low carbon fuel standards in the state of Oregon for transportation fuels as a feedstock for renewable diesel or SAF is a very low hanging fruit opportunity that's already in existence under the Washington Clean Fuel Standard. So there's existing legislation in neighboring states. I think encouraging through incentives and potential grant programs like California has for increased anaerobic digestion collection of RNG is another great use case. So there's lots of existing policies in neighboring states that have supported the collection of avoided methane and then the use of that as a energy source for a variety of different things. It's a fungible commodity that can be used across different industries, but Oregon's lacking appropriate incentives to justify those investments.
That's great. That's a good barrier, is that there's insufficient incentives to pull in renewable natural gas into Oregon. And I do see you invoked the name of Sam Wade, and Sam does have his hand raised. So I'll open it up to Sam, and then we'll we'll move on to our next key finding area.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for teeing things up, John. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'd say it's a challenge in that RNG crosses sectors, and sometimes it's sort of a seams issue in climate planning. It creates methane reductions in the waste sector and in agriculture in many cases. And then it uses that methane, as a fuel in really any application that currently is served by conventional gas. So because it has that overlap in the sector, sometimes which sector incentivizes it or pays for it is challenging. But we believe in the near term, the focus should be on just achieving the methane reductions and getting the gas in the pipeline. And then you can shift the gas toward the hard to electrify sectors over time. And I agree with John that we don't know exactly which sectors are the hardest to electrify in the long run yet. And certainly aviation, heavy duty trucking, those are good candidates for being hard to electrify. So, the RNG should be eligible to serve those end uses and be recognized for the near term methane reductions it creates.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And I hear, again, I hate to be the bad guy, solutions in some of that, but we will put those into the parking lot, and I'll pull some of the barriers that I heard in there out. In particular, Sam, what you said, it's the barrier of getting RNG just into use, regardless of what the end use is important.
And I think just giving proper credit for its net climate benefits on a life cycle basis has been a big challenge.
That's a good one too.
Almost no RPS programs recognize that. Very few utility procurement programs are based on full life cycle accounting, et cetera.
Great. All right, thank you. And I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you for the participation, the input, and hand it back to Michael to take us into break. I think we're going into break.
Yeah, that's right, Jessica. So we do have a scheduled 10-minute break that we'll take right now. So I see it as 10:32. So we'll take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:42 and launch into our next round of key findings. And we'll launch into our third key takeaway. Edith, I don't believe I'm seeing your screen if you're sharing the PowerPoint.
How about now? Still not.
No, not yet.
Let me try again.
Thank you. Oh, looks like we got it. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so our third key finding from the modeling is that electrification is more cost-effective than adopting low-carbon fuels in many applications. So if we go in the next slide, in the transportation sector, the modeling approach is to fully electrify the light-duty fleet and much of the medium and heavy-duty vehicle fleet by 2050. Low-carbon fuels will support aviation, rail, maritime, and all conventional vehicles that remain in the vehicle stock through 2050 across all sectors. So in the visual, you can see the fossil fuels are that dark gray and low carbon fuels are green and electricity is light blue. So if we go to the next slide, we look at this in terms of direct use fuel. So we saw this slide earlier, so just to remind you of this slide again. So to meet decarbonization targets, the model electrifies most commercial and residential building demand, and what fuel demand remains is met by biomass or biogas low carbon fuels. And so that's where you'd see your renewable natural gas. And industry demand decreases a little bit, which you could see in that first row in the industry and agriculture due to kind of efficiency, and there might be a little bit of electrification and improvements in equipment technology, but for the most part, that demand remains the same and it's met by low carbon fuel options. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, the modeling shows that delaying electrification leads to higher system-wide costs for Oregon to achieve its goals. So this graph shows a comparison of 3 different analyses where electrification is delayed compared to the reference scenario. So all 3 show greater overall system-wide costs resulting from increased reliance on fossil and low-carbon fuels. So the first one, the no advanced clean truck scenario. We've also got the delayed energy efficiency and building electrification. And then the third one is delayed transportation electrification scenario. So modeling results are based on available data today and show that the least cost pathway to achieving Oregon's energy and climate goals is to electrify end uses as early as possible, while using fuels strategically for the hardest to electrify applications. So we go to the next slide, we can kind of compare some of those findings to where we are in terms of electrification today. So today, light-duty electrification is beginning to take off in Oregon within the transportation sector. And while the barriers to transportation electrification are being addressed by a separate working group led by Jillian, which we'll start having meetings coming soon, the rate of adoption has implications for low carbon fuel needs. So we're looking at electrification, thinking about it in terms of the impact to fuels. So this chart shows the cumulative light-duty battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles registered in Oregon through mid-2024. So a little bit more updated information, because this chart was actually used in our bioenergy report. So as of November, we've actually exceeded 100,000 vehicles, and EVs now make up 2.92% of Oregon's light-duty vehicles. So it's come a long way, but it's still a small percentage. Medium heavy duty adoption is in the early stages of adoption as well. And so there are about 662 registered vehicles. And this includes school and transit buses and a variety of other medium heavy duty vehicles. And Oregon currently has a target of at least 25% of registered motor vehicles and at least 50% of new motor vehicles sold annually will be zero emission vehicles by 2030. So if we look at the next slide, building electrification, kind of where we are today. So in the residential sector, more than half of Oregon's homes heat with electricity. But it's also important to kind of balance that fact with Oregon has a high prevalence of electric resistance heating, especially in rural areas of the state without access to natural gas. And cooling types vary among Oregon homes, but the market share of efficient heat pumps is growing. Regional data analysis shows as of 2022, heat pumps had reached about 61% of new heating equipment sales and about 64% of new cooling equipment sales. And Odo supports a community heat pump deployment program and rental home heating program, both of which allow electrification. And we've also awarded $114 million for home energy rebates under IRA, and about half of that will go to the home electrification and appliance rebate program, which supports electrification in low and moderate income households of Oregon. And we're also awarded a federal EPA grant of $24 million to help fund the purchase of heat pumps in Oregon residences, and that should be available later this year. So adoption of more efficient heat pump water heaters is also growing, and it's reached about 18% of new sales as of 2022. So that's the residential sector. In the commercial sector, there are some utility-led efficiency programs for commercial buildings, but not specific electrification activities driving change. So that's important to keep in mind. And then if we go to the next slide, if we look at industrial electrification, the industrial sector uses electricity to operate motors, lights, computers, office equipment, a variety of different things. And electrifying HVAC in buildings and local applications may be the greatest opportunity within this sector, but as you saw before, even in the modeling, there aren't as much opportunity within the industrial sector for electrification. And there aren't any specific industry electrification programs in Oregon or policies driving that change, although there are a lot of energy efficiency programs that help with that, reducing total energy consumption. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to talk about key challenges within electrification.
Thanks, Michael. I was responding to John in the chat. He had some questions. I think he was asking about what study we're referring to around heat pump adoption. Is that correct? Yes, he said yes. So just briefly before I dive into the key challenges, I'll just say, Michael, actually, you should probably answer that question because I'll get it wrong.
No, that's okay. So that was a BPA study when they were doing some research around heat pump sales. And I'm happy to share that information with you. But it is I do want to highlight that's 2022. So 2024 numbers could be different. That data just isn't available yet.
Thanks, Michael. So thanks, Michael, for the summary of the modeling results and the state of electrification in Oregon today. And just to note that we have other policy working groups that are focused on the barriers to electrification, both in the transportation sector and the transportation sector and the building sector. And so that discussions around barriers for those activities of electrification are happening in those groups. So really the focus of our work here is about the issues and concerns and challenges that are faced in the fuel industry and fuel side of things as electrification is occurring. We know that electrification, based on the modeling results, is a key element to meeting our energy and climate goals. And as more end uses move to using electricity, fewer fossil fuels are going to be needed to support vehicles and residential and commercial heating and other applications. So with this declining use, the costs to maintain and operate existing systems are going to be borne by fewer customers. And some of these systems are at risk of becoming stranded assets until they can be repurposed. This leads to a really challenging brainstorming exercise that we're about to dive into. We're looking at basically an energy future with fewer fuels in the mix. But at the same time, there are critical spaces that fuels need to continue to support even in 2050. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section, but I just wanted to tee that up. So before we dive into this exercise, I just want to encourage you to do two things. First, be as candid as you feel comfortable about the barriers. I think we all recognize that some of these results have serious business model implications for fuel providers. And it's really important to capture that here because no viable business model could mean the pathway cannot be successful without some additional policies or policy considerations. And second, this is the time to identify barriers. And then next time we meet, we'll be working on identifying those solutions and opportunities to address those barriers. So please don't worry about sounding too negative. Today, and hopefully only today, I'm going to ask all of you to kind of access your inner Eeyore, the famous donkey from the Winnie the Pooh series, who tended to see all the negative things in life. And I think that we're not really here to see all the negative things in life as much as we are to put them down on paper so that we can then look at them and think about what types of solutions and problem solving we can put towards those barriers. So that's my encouragement as you dive into this. And so bearing all of this in mind, I quickly want to add if there's any general high-level clarifying questions about the modeling that we can help answer here. And then I'll have us dive into the discussion and leave a lot of room for discussion. I'm sorry, dive into the brainstorming and leave a lot of room for discussion at the end. All right, seeing none, I will pass it back to Michael to begin this.
All right, great. If we could move back to our Miro board. And now we're going to go to the electrification section. It looks like it's got some blue stickies now. So what are the primary issues or barriers to electrifying applications and strategically using fuels? So we've got 4 different categories. We've got transportation, industry and agriculture, residential and commercial, and other. So we broke it out by sectors, but obviously there's many different ways to talk about kind of fuels and its relationship to electrification. And then the pink stickies over to the left are some of those key takeaways that we added at a high level. So if you could, please, we'll start a timer for 5 minutes and please start putting in stickies. Looks like people are already doing so. And if you have any challenge with that, please let us know, but we'll do silent time now for 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 1 minute left. Thank you. All right, we've got a minute left for brainstorming. Thank you. Okay, so we've reached time, and it looks like we've got some great stickies up there. So maybe we'll start the discussion, but please continue to add those sticky notes. And I will highlight, I know we're pressed for time as we roll through this, but there are additional avenues to provide feedback on all this stuff. I know Sam had to jump off for probably another meeting, and so I'll try to follow up with you, but also if you think of other ideas, please email them to me and we can continue to add barriers to these groupings. Jessica, are you ready to kind of launch the discussion?
Yes, if I can find my mute button. Actually, if I can find my cursor, which was the real challenge there. So great stuff that's going into the Miro whiteboard right now. I kind of want to start with a really specific one, and then I'm going to move to some of the broader themes that I see here. But I thought it was really interesting that someone threw in a workforce development for training technicians to service EVs. And I kind of want to open that thought up. And if you were the one who made that comment, please feel free to come off mute and talk more about it. But I've been thinking about some of the challenges around like fleets, in that if you are electrifying piecemeal as vehicles reach their end of their natural lifetime, you have to sort of maintain expertise to service and operate two different types of vehicles, potentially more than that if you're working with other lower carbon fuels. So are there other areas of fuel use where there's this concern about workforce development training for people to help maintain and operate the different technologies that will be coming about? Oh, John, yes.
Yeah, I think this is a great point and a huge problem for almost every energy transition sector. For example, you know, our project that we're developing is going to require 100+ employees who are highly trained, capable of working in a very complex environment in a rural part of Eastern Washington. That workforce does not exist in the state. We're going to have to create that workforce. And that's every facility that's going to do anything in this energy transition sector, whether it's EVs or clean fuels or servicing and maintaining all of these new solutions. It applies to every single aspect. So I think it's a really topical point and be a great way to engage the state at a university and community college level.
Thanks, John. I see Michael's hand raised, and I have a feeling he wants to add to this.
Yeah, I threw that one in there, and I also threw one similar in the industry and agriculture one, focused on right to work. I mean, especially in rural communities with existing technology, a lot of folks, they've got, or even in disadvantaged communities, you have like that guy down the corner that does everything, right? Every community has that guy that will fix, cars or what have you. And especially in rural communities, a lot of, farmers are going to, want to fix their own equipment. And I just think that it's the availability of the training, or just like being a little bit afraid of like not being able to work on your own equipment, that holds some people back from, or quite a few people back from adopting it. I mean, we saw the right to work resistance with John Deere, right? And I think that extends to just being able to work on your own electric, equipment, vehicles, that kind of thing.
Great, thanks. good input on this, and I want to I forgot to mention earlier that if you want to add comments into this discussion and you're having problems with Miro, our whiteboard here, please feel free to just send them in the chat or join the conversation now to get your concerns or questions out to the group for discussion. Any of those options are available to you. So I kind of want to, I see there's a number of stickies in this whiteboard that are really alluding to the fact that there are the fuel providers and the infrastructure that they have and the experience that they have. These are all important things, and there's a concern around how we are able to work with these fuel providers in a way that's helping them to be a part of this clean energy transition that is occurring in the state. And I just kind of want to ask if there's anyone who wants to sort of elaborate on what barriers they see to having more of these sort of open conversations about how to bring in fuel providers into the work that we're all engaging in here on this transition that we're working to identify options to solve. And I apologize, I had a coughing fit there and I didn't make that very clear. So I'm curious if there are folks who want to join in the conversation about what are some of the challenges that fuel providers have, and are there specific barriers that prevent the conversations that need to occur in order to figure out how to include them and bring them into the fold in ways that we're working on this, our clean energy future. Brian.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously I represent the Pacific Propane Gas Association on this call, which is the propane marketers, distributors within the state of Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. Also the president and CEO of Conergy Propane, a local propane distribution company. And I think from my perspective, the biggest challenge is kind of what the sticky says, kind of vilifying us as a fossil fuel feedstock provider today, and not necessarily considering or subsidizing the conversion to renewable feedstocks. I think there's a path for the existing, whether it's renewable natural gas, renewable propane, that plays within this picture, that already has infrastructure in place that should be brought in to a more involved level of discussion on what does it take to convert from that conventional feedstock to the renewable feedstock, and how does that play in this transition for the state. And I'm just concerned right now we're kind of missing that conversation of converting from conventional to renewable feedstocks for the industry, and instead looking to just migrate away from these fuels completely in the plan and in the upcoming future.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate you jumping in. And just happened to be going through fuels data the other day that we put together for some of our reports, and I noticed that there's a lot more renewable propane than I remember there being the last time we had assessed the fuel mix. So it was really cool to be able to see that kind of adoption happening in Oregon. And I'm curious, like, what are the barriers that you're seeing from your vantage point and perspective in bringing more renewable fuel into your own supply and getting that into Oregon in particular, but maybe more regionally as well?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep that response quick. I think there's a couple barriers from us in the industry from an investment perspective. There is renewable, and I'll speak specifically to propane. There is renewable propane available today. The demand outweighs the supply. And there's technologies and feedstocks available there but requires pretty significant investment. And I think the community is concerned about investing in some of those feedstocks if these end uses are going to go away, whether it's the building permits on eliminating gas appliances or the infrastructure necessary to kind of support these. And again, speaking specifically about Co-Energy, we are integrating renewable propane into our supply today. And we are intimately involved with a product, a agricultural product called Camelina sativa, that's used as a feedstock for renewable aviation fuel and for renewable propane. The concern is for the farmers in Oregon to invest in the infrastructure to be able to grow, store, and ship that feedstock if there isn't a end user market that's going to be available in the future. And so there's this confusion within the marketplace of, are we going to eliminate the use cases for clean fuels? Then why would we invest large amounts of capital investment upfront today if those markets aren't going to be available in the future?
I think that's a really good point, and I appreciate you jumping in and giving us your perspective in this. I see John's hand raised, so I wanted to open the floor up to him.
Hi, I just wanted to start by saying I really appreciate that comment, and then to kind of, I think a good piggyback, my name is John Garrett. I work for the Oregon Citizens Utility Board. So I advocate on behalf of residential ratepayers, including natural gas and electric ratepayers in Oregon. And one issue I'm finding is, I see a lot of modeling about the really efficient and market proven technologies to produce utility scale renewable electricity, right? And then I see a lot more uncertainty about the direct fuels kind of opportunity and cost effectiveness for residential and commercial use in buildings. And the problem is, with distribution infrastructure, you end up with 50-year plus investments in direct fuels distribution infrastructure, right? And it's just really risky for ratepayers to make 50-year investments in direct fuels use for residential and maybe commercial, small commercial applications too, when I just don't have confidence that the low cost decarbonized fuel will be direct fuels for this application relative to electrification. And then there's also the matter of heat pumps and their efficiency over standard conventional heating or conventional furnaces. So you have both the fuel going, the fuel itself decarbonizing, and then the efficiency at the end use, which seem to favor electrification. So again, just from the residential ratepayer advocacy side, I have to advocate for the least cost, least risk solution to decarbonization. And it's not about picking teams or sides or industries. It's about doing what's best for ratepayers.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate that. And I want to add a couple things. One, discussions around those end uses will really be a focus of a different working group that's focusing on energy efficiency and distributed energy resources, and how those are, how the end uses that I'm getting mixed up because there's end uses, but there's also supply side stuff that's happening there. That's just a big whole thing that's going on, but they're going to talk about that more in that group. So you might want to follow along with their work as well. But I want to get back to the consumer side of things, because I think it's interesting the costs that we're talking about from the model are showing us economy-wide costs for the state of Oregon. In addition to that, we're going to be publishing an energy wallet that looks at what the costs are for different I don't know the term that I want to use for it. You can't, like, there's no average Oregonian, there's no average rural Oregonian, but we're trying our best to like assess sort of like what the cost might be to an individual living in different parts of the state or with a different heating or cooling system in their home. So that information will also be presented, and it may provide different information than what the economy-wide costs are showing. And I'm curious if you or any of the other fuel providers that are in this group have had any experiences with customers who've reached out about concerns about the type of fuel that they're going to be using or the cost that might be associated with that fuel, and if you'd be interested in sharing those thoughts with the group.
I'll jump in and add our experience with that. Is yes, this is an ongoing conversation we have with our existing customers on a regular basis today on, building a new home, what type of appliances they select based on if those are going to be mandated to get replaced in the future. And I do appreciate the statement or the lack of availability on what is the average wallet share of utility use for an average house home. And again, I would encourage her to reach out to some of the direct fuel providers. We model what that usage and cost looks like on a daily basis as part of the business model. And so at a more discrete level within the state of Oregon, I would imagine a lot of the direct fuel companies providing services today would have some of that information that may be able to be shared.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And quick follow-up for you. I'm guessing, but I could be wrong, that you might serve more of Oregon's rural communities. To your knowledge, what other options are available to them to have like heating or cooking or whatever their fuel use needs are at their homes or businesses other than the propane that's being served in that area?
Yeah, great question. And in general, propane is used as an alternative direct fuel use where natural gas isn't available for economic reasons. So we do typically serve primarily a lot of the rural communities throughout the state as an industry.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate that context. Okay, we've got time for a few more questions around this, and I don't see any hands raised. So if you do have something you want to jump in, oh, look at that, Michael, what you got?
Sorry, I can't help myself. I think when we talk about electrifying residential and commercial, and again, this isn't my industry, but just speaking from personal experience, I mean, for folks that have existing internal, existing infrastructure that we're trying to switch to electric, I think one of the big barriers is that the policy portfolio available to us sometimes favors 100% zero emission versus like a piecemeal step towards zero emission. So I threw a personal example in there, but if you even when you're an energy nerd trying to do the right thing, you can't find the incentives to help you do that because they don't exist.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. And I think that's something that we might dive into a little more in our next key finding. But I wanted to throw out another question, especially for those of you who are involved in either developing or supporting low carbon fuel adoption. And that's a wide variety of people, from renewable natural gas and our natural gas utilities to those people who run clean cities or support clean cities work. But these renewable fuels or clean fuels that are out there, in the context of electrification, what are the barriers or concerns that you might have about the future of low carbon fuels in Oregon? Michael Graham, you're not going to come to the rescue? Jump in with this.
Frankly, I didn't hear you because I was focused on typing a comment. What was the question?
Fair. We want comments. You know, from your perspective, when it comes to low carbon fuels and that adoption, this is kind of teeing off of what you mentioned before, which is in the context of electrification that we're seeing as happening throughout the next 25 years. How do you see barriers for low carbon fuels adoption and use occurring as a result of some of the electrification actions that are happening? Like medium and heavy duty vehicles are using a lot of renewable diesel today. As electric options come online, there won't be potentially as many that need to use that renewable diesel. Like, what are some of the concerns or barriers that you see in the low carbon fuel space, considering electrification is going to be going on during this time frame?
I think it's really hard to imagine that time where electric vehicles in the medium and heavy duty sector are consuming so much electricity and so little diesel that it creates that kind of problem, just because the uptick in medium and heavy duty vehicles currently is so slow because the vehicles are so expensive and the infrastructure is so expensive.
Is the rate of electrification then though something that is a consideration though when it comes to low carbon fuel availability?
I don't think it's discussed right now because, I mean, it's, I'm just being blunt. It's just happening so slowly that I don't think we've pivoted to that problem yet in the industry. Everyone's trying to figure out how they can afford a $500,000 truck.
Yep, totally fair.
And it's not like there's a lack of interest. I think there's a lot of fleets out there that want it, right? They think the technology is cool. They see an economic value proposition if they can offset the upfront cost with grants or incentives, but there's just a lack of grants and incentives, especially outside the Portland area, because up until maybe this point, you know, the only program that has funded medium and heavy duty vehicles in the state have been like the DEQ, Diesel Emission Mitigation Grant Program, PG's electric school bus program. I know Pac Power has their own program, but you know, if you're outside those the metro area and those IOU service areas, it's really tough to get a medium and heavy duty vehicle. I mean, obviously there's some, you know, there's some caveats there, but it's tough. There's not a lot of incentives.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. And I'm going to hand it back over to Michael Friels to take us to the last key finding of the model.
Okay, great. Thanks, Edith, putting the slides back up. Okay, so our final key finding related to fuels is demand declines, but fuels remain a significant component of Oregon's energy system across all scenarios. So if we go to the next slide, in the model, fuels portion of Oregon energy demand drops from 70% of energy demand estimated in 2024 to 26% in 2050. So fuel use remains in hard to electrify sectors of industry, transportation, electricity generation, as we've talked about, but fuels continue to provide energy resilience. It'll take a long time for electric technologies to replace fossil fuel using applications, as we pointed out, in the barriers, and fuels will be critical during that time. So electrification is driving this reduction in demand, especially electrification of vehicles, buildings, and some manufacturing processes. But low carbon fuels also gradually replace fossil fuel demand over time. And you can see that in that light blue section. So the dark gray is fossil fuels, and you can see the light blue kind of overtaking the dark gray in use. Okay, so let's compare these modeling results to what we're seeing today. So if we go to the next slide and look at transportation fuel consumption as a whole. So the transportation sector consistently uses the most energy in Oregon. And so a lot of this data is from 2022. And at that time, petroleum-based products accounted for about 91% of the fuel consumed in the transportation sector. This is what we published in our biennial energy report this last fall. Alternative fuels or biofuels like ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel accounted for about 8.6%, and electricity and natural gas accounted for 0.3% of the fuels consumed. I know we mentioned kind of the market growth in the last meeting for renewable diesel in particular. And so I took a look at that information, more recent information from 2023. and saw that renewable diesel reached 5.68% of market share, which actually exceeded biodiesel. So that was exciting to see. And if we go to the next slide and look at transportation fuel consumption over time, you can certainly see that petroleum fuel consumption has steadily increased over time and dominates transportation fuel use in Oregon. I don't think that should come as any surprise to anybody in this meeting. And in 2022, just 1.6% of transportation fuel used in Oregon was produced in the state. So remember, we talked about kind of the ethanol and the biodiesel that was produced in the state. So it's a small amount, and maybe that's an opportunity or something we want to talk about barriers. I certainly got that feeling from this group that there might be some interest in some local production. Oregon does not have any crude oil reserves or refineries to process petroleum at this point. So about 90% of the petroleum products delivered to and consumed in Oregon come from 4 refineries in Washington state. And then if we switch to the next slide, we look at this consumption in terms of direct use fuels. And direct use fuels are fuels like natural gas, woody biomass, heating oil, or propane that are used directly in Oregon's residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, just to clarify. And so these fuels are used for cooking, for heating buildings, and to support commercial and industrial manufacturing processes. They do not include fuels used to generate electricity or support the transportation sector, so completely separate from that. And natural gas is the most consumed direct use fuel in Oregon, so it's that red color there in the pie chart. And nearly all of it is imported from Canada and the Rocky Mountain states for the most part. Okay, so if we look at direct use fuels consumption over time, Oregon's consumption of direct use fuels has evolved, and this has meant decreasing wood and fuel oil use and an increase in natural gas. You can see natural gas at the top there in that red. The biomass line, you see, it's kind of that, I guess I would call that kind of a yellowish brown color. And natural gas has replaced heating oil and coal use in many Oregon buildings and industrial processes over time. But Oregon industry also uses a significant amount of biomass energy from secondary waste products like lumber mill residue, logging slash, and animal manure. And biomass energy consumption has actually shown an increase since 2002, and this is due almost entirely to increased demand for biofuels. Another thing to kind of consider, direct use fuel use is really tied to population growth in Oregon. It's a big contributing factor to consumption growth and the emissions attributed to it. So from 2000 to 2021, Oregon's population increased by about 20%. And during that time, Oregon's industrial sector actually converted a lot of petroleum consumption to natural gas, lowering the carbon intensity, and a lot of energy efficiency measures were invested in, contributed to about a 12% decrease in emissions from the industrial sector. But this was offset because we had such the boom in economic growth and population growth within the state, and it actually increased emissions by about 29% for the residential commercial sector. So kind of offsetting those gains of the industrial sector. So kind of, I wanted to highlight that as kind of the importance of considering all market forces happening within this energy transition. It's not just fuels, but it's a lot of other economic forces that are impacting things. So if we go to the next slide and look at it in terms of electricity use. So previously when I talked about electricity generation, that was just what was generated in Oregon, but this is looking at electricity use in terms of what we consume. And so if we're looking at what we're consuming over time, within this kind of bar chart, you can see that the base load, that kind of turquoise color, is hydroelectric power. And then above that in gray is is coal, coal generated electricity. And then the red above that is natural gas. So hydropower generation tends to fluctuate depending on water conditions. So you see that fluctuation year to year, but it's consistently the foundational piece of electricity generation within Oregon. And other renewable energy resources, you can see at the top, kind of that wind in orange, and you can see the yellow of solar near the top. They're a growing part of Oregon's mix, but you can kind of see that hydropower and natural gas and coal kind of dominate the majority of that electricity mix. So if we look at this in terms of just 2022, so the next slide, we look at Oregon's electricity mix. I do want to highlight the brown circle there, which is the unspecified electricity category. And so this is when a utility buys electricity on the open market, that electricity is deemed unspecified. It's expected that natural gas probably accounts for some of this. Probably there's some coal electricity within that. A lot of hydro gets put in that unspecified category. The utility is just not aware exactly when they're buying it off the market, where exactly it's coming from or where it was created. So overall, in 2022, Oregon got most of its electricity from hydropower, And so those unspecified market purchases, natural gas and coal. I do want to note that, you know, this chart is from 2022, and these change year to year. And, you know, the amount coming from wind, coming from solar is consistently growing. And then we also have some existing statutes that are changing these things, and it's a policy to keep in mind. So in 2016, the Oregon legislature passed Senate Bill 1547, which directed Oregon's investor-owned utilities to remove coal from rates by 2030. And so that's certainly reducing the portion of coal. And in many cases, that's growing the amount of natural gas we need for electricity generation. And in 2021, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2021, which directs PacifiCorp PG and the state's electricity service suppliers to decarbonize their electricity mixes. And so that's having an impact as well. But we can see that fossil fuels are a significant portion of this electricity mix. And we certainly know if we're going to make some changes, there's going to be something that needs to fill that space. And renewables are likely to grow, but we will need kind of a firm or on-demand resource to support this system. So that's an overview of a lot of those different areas around kind of the change in fuel demand. So I'll switch it over to Jessica to talk about key challenges within this.
Thanks, Michael. Michael Graham had a question in the chat about biodiesel. I think you were referring to the transportation fuels chart that we showed. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. You know what? As I was looking at that, I could not remember where we captured renewable diesel. So Michael Friels, do you remember if that was captured in biodiesel or if it's in somewhere else?
So it was in this 2022 data, it was small enough that I think it was incorporated in biodiesel, but I didn't see it as a category. And so that's why I looked up and said, oh, and saw, you know, what's the most recent numbers. And so I pulled 2023 data, and that was that renewable diesel was up to kind of 5% of that market share. And that had actually exceeded, it was more than biodiesel, which I thought was interesting.
Thanks, Michael Friels. So basically the focus of this key finding is that electrification is happening, but there are still vehicles, appliances, and furnaces, other end uses that will need to have access to fuels. And at the same time, low carbon fuels will be available for some applications and in some areas, things like renewable diesel and biogas. And it's expected that there would be, excuse me, information and developments in new economies supporting zero carbon fueling options. And these are more far future things like hydrogen. Business and industry would need to weigh different fueling options, investments, and timelines as they're thinking about different fueling options. Utility regulators would need to contend with, excuse me, regulators would need to contend with understanding the effects of different fueling investments and choices on system planning, system reliability, and ratepayer costs. And just like gas plants will operate at a lower capacity factor, there's a sort of a parallel to other fueling infrastructure. And what do we think about this? Could we leverage that infrastructure or repurpose it? These are kinds of the kinds of things that we are that kind of rose to the top for us as far as key challenges go. So last time I will pause just to see if there are any questions about the model findings or clarifications on the model findings or anything that needs to be clarified in these key challenges listed before we dive into the whiteboarding exercise. All right, seeing none, I will move back to Michael, who's going to carry us through this last exercise.
Okay, so we're going back to the Miro board, and right now we're at the top of the Miro board. So the first option at the top of the board, and then we're showing it right there. So what are the primary issues or barriers to reducing fuel demand? So we've got a couple of different categories here. We've got consumer behavior, cost availability, infrastructure, supply, and then other at the bottom. Yeah, so we will start the timer at 5 minutes and do our quiet time where we're coming up with more stickies, and then launch right into discussion right after that. I'm excited to see what people come up with. Okay, we've got about a minute left of our quiet time brainstorming. I do want to flag that as we're thinking about barriers, thinking about in terms of time, I know a lot of the things we've talked about are kind of long-term barriers or long-term challenges, but thinking in terms of, we're going to want to create near-term policy solutions. So what are our near-term policy barriers that we want to identify? What do we need to kind of address in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, to get us on a path? Not necessarily thinking about that 2050 goal, but what could we do more immediately that could put us on a good path between like now and 2030 or 2035? So please keep that in mind as you're thinking about kind of near-term barriers. Thank you. All right, so it looks like we've gone through our 5 minutes of brainstorming. Now can launch into discussion. Jessica, may I ask you to lead us in this discussion?
Absolutely. I wanted to kind of first start by flagging something earlier when Brian was sort of leading us in this discussion around the challenges that propane is seeing as far as like they have these option available today, renewable propane, and enabling the bringing of that low carbon fuel into any kind of end use application, which will further support the market for developing renewable propane. And I'm curious, I was going to ask if Brittany and Devin wanted to jump in, and Devin jumped off, unfortunately, after I had written that down. So Brittany, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am curious if you've got any thoughts or overarching concerns that natural gas, Northwest Natural in particular, is seeing as far as like bringing more renewable natural gas into the use at the utility.
Yeah, I can address that. As I stated before, our number one barrier is uncertainty and cost recovery. And so if we have facilitated policies that let us know we can invest into these renewables, that will make it a lot easier for us. We actually have a huge pipeline of really cool projects we would like to do. We just have a lot of policy uncertainty on if we're able to do those and get cost recovery.
That's great. So I'm hearing there's some regulation barriers and sort of just broad investment type barriers and how we work with that fuel in a way that makes sense economically. I'm curious, since I've already put Brittany on the spot, I'm going to put another person on the spot who I haven't heard from yet, and I hope that she'll forgive me. But Corianne, I would love to hear your perspective on some of the barriers around low carbon fuel adoption in the state of Oregon, considering all of these different options that are available, different types of fuels that are available, and the state of general of electrification going on in the background.
Yeah, hi Jessica. I don't think video was working, but anyway, I'll try and answer that. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, I've been listening attentively, and it is so hard to kind of capture the uncertainty in the fuels world these days. I mean, I apologize for that, but between kind of global things going on and federal things going on and state and local policy going on, there are so many moving parts that, that there's such a huge question mark about it. And, do I think there's enough feedstocks? Yes. Do I think there's enough technology out there? Yes. Do I think there's enough infrastructure out there? Right. We're talking about lower carbon liquid fuels at this point. Yes. Right. I think the market certainty as pointed out earlier, is a huge question mark. I think, you know, things like technology, I think exists at very large scale. So, you know, I don't think that that's the problem. I mean, even in something as specific as this question about the renewable propane, I mean, can we make it? Sure. But you know, it's not even necessarily with a feedstock or a market. I mean, it's kind of that's a technology kind of question. I mean, you may make renewable propane when you make renewable diesel, and you can make renewable naphtha, right? So back to even the question about on the gasoline side, whether there's a renewable gasoline, well, you have renewable naphtha. But with so many moving parts, can you make decisions on whether the renewable naphtha makes sense to pull out, and the renewable propane, is it, you know, are there enough incentives to pull out? Are you maximizing for renewable diesel or for sustainable aviation fuel, right? It comes from the technology is all intertwined. And so it's not as simple as just credit prices in an LCFS market. Right? It's whether you're getting a tax credit on a federal level, or getting generation of RINs. I mean, I apologize for being so hand wavy about it, but it's, you know, I mean, it's one of these things that we all pay attention to. And I don't know if there's any one thing that any one state or any one, you know, regulation or policy can actually address. So.
Is there anything that can be done to better highlight some of the very specific needs that are like for particular end uses, particular types of transportation, or to flag issues with the cost to, you know, as you say, pull out the naphtha and make it available, or the costs that are associated with actually making that, getting that naphtha to market, those kinds of things. Are there any specific items that you think warrant more understanding and study to help inform future discussions on this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think for the state of Oregon, you know, currently the regulations and incentives that are in place, I think on the liquid fuel side, you know, most of that incentives comes from the Clean Fuels program. And so I know that there have been kind of questions about, you know, is there ability to expand clean fuels beyond transportation, maybe some things like, you know, industrial stationary source uses, heating oil uses, those kinds of things that are currently exempt, but there's definitely potential for market use in other things in really greater quantities. If you're starting to talk about rail and marine and, you know, all those kinds of things. I don't necessarily think the Clean Fuels program is the only way that you can incentivize that. I think there could be complementary kind of policies to do that. I don't know if, you know, I think it's always an interesting question about whether you want to regulate it and mandate it or provide incentives, you know, through, you know, state level, local tax credits, you know, those kinds of things. But I think the infrastructure is there. I think the fuel is there. You know, there are billions of gallons of these things that are being produced these days. And I think everybody in the supply chain is really smart about how to, even if it's not produced in Oregon, I think how to get it to Oregon. I think a lot of folks have figured that out. And so it is an interesting dynamic now with California and Oregon and Washington all getting so much attention from the rest of the country. I don't think that's a problem anymore. And so it is how to stack those incentives.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. And kind of building on what you said, I'm seeing in the chat a discussion going on about, renewable diesel. And I'm curious, this is an open question, not just to Corey, but Corey, you're more than welcome to jump in. It seems like there's like tremendous competition for renewable diesel now, particularly in California, Oregon, and upcoming Washington. What are some of the biggest barriers to Oregon being competitive in that particular market and bringing that fuel and other fuels like renewable diesel into our market to support our programs? Knowing there are existing programs in place to help with some of that, but what else is missing as far as getting those fuels into Oregon?
Maybe I'll start and somebody else can chime in, but I think unfortunately, without the in-state capacity to produce right now, and that, may change in the future with proposed facilities. But right now, since so much of the production of the renewable on the West Coast is focused in California, that we're still like a taker of a market with respect to those fuels. I mean, California now, there's like 75% of the diesel pool is renewable diesel and biodiesel, which is amazing. And so you foresee at some, in a couple year type time frame, that market being saturated.
Yeah.
As for medium heavy duty, really increases in California. Again, uncertainty with waivers, etc. But right. So, I mean, I guess the way that I always see that supply of renewable diesel, it's how fast is California going to electrify so that the demand for that liquid fuel goes down, and then how quickly those facilities switch to SAF.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that is two very different kind of things that are going on. And then, right, so as some of these refineries switch to SAF, then the amount of RD that's going to be available decreases. And again, how much is going to be able to come to Oregon? I think similarly with the Washington refineries, but there are lots of other facilities that are not on the West Coast that can provide those kinds of fuels too. I mean, along the Gulf Coast in the Midwest, there's a ton, a lot of gallons being produced to come to the West Coast because of the markets. But I think all those kinds of things still kind of dictate what volumes are really going to be available to Oregon.
Thanks, Corey. Appreciate that input. I see that Antonio has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just would like to clarify a couple things. The refineries that are in the West Coast, and a refinery is very expensive and very difficult to change. Permitting is almost impossible, and also it is more viable for a refiner to say we're not playing anymore than sometimes to transform. Understanding logistics and the infrastructure, if we're talking about production in the Midwest and trying to bring it to the West Coast, there's no infrastructure that can viably do it if there's a certain demand. It's just impossible. The cost, it would be unbearable and just make it, there would be no incentive basically to do it. So I think that what we need to do is to make sure that there's a clear understanding of the ramifications of policies and the current situations, and then as to how that will affect the producers and those that have the equipment to be able to do it in order to plan for the future.
Thanks, Antonio. I like to that makes me think about sort of this question of where Oregon sits in the broader fuel market picture. And this is a general question for the group, but where it seems like we've identified that there's sort of a barrier in that right now Oregon is, we are a part of a market, but we aren't market drivers in a lot of ways. We have some options to help drive the market, like our Clean Fuels program, but that limits our ability to develop policies that can influence the way that these fuels are made available in the state. And sort of, so my question is that like a barrier, or is that a feature that we just need to work within that construct? Or are there other barriers besides just sort of our place in the market that we can affect as we work on as we look to a future where more low carbon fuels are necessary to help decarbonize all these sectors? Antonio. And then I see Brittany, so I'll let Antonio go first and then Brittany.
Sorry, I promise this will be my last comment, but I think it's a barrier, definitely, that when you have the ability to produce in state, it gives you some sort of ability to be more flexible when it comes to changing conditions. And right now there are so many conditions and variables and things that are in play that make it very hard for me to predict what's going to happen. So being a net importer of energy, depending on what other states do and their demand, and if there's incentive to bring to Oregon, I think that's something that definitely needs to be considered and be at the top of the discussion before committing to something that can bite us later on.
Thanks, Antonio. Brittany, I see your hand went down, but I just want to make sure you
Yeah.
didn't want to jump in.
Oh, yeah, just to add to that a little bit. So we purchase RNG off the market, and I can say that the supply is there. We're able to purchase, we have run an RFP every year. There's way more available than we ever could purchase. So the supply is there. It's just the matter of like how much we're able to purchase based on regulatory policies. I know I sound like a beating drum there, but so for us, it's not the supply, it's not the cost. There's some markets that we just know, like things like dairy, manure produced RNG is going to automatically go to probably California because you can get more money for it there. But as a whole, there is a lot of supply. It's just our ability to actually purchase as much as we want to because we don't have those policies in place that give us regulatory certainty. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, this was a focus on barriers this time around. So seeing no other hands, and we're getting close to time, I will move us to wrapping things up, and Michael's going to share with us what our next steps are. I would encourage all of you to turn your cameras on briefly just so we can look at each other's faces before we go on our different ways. But I just want to extend my personal thank you. And I know this is a big time investment, but your input and expertise are invaluable to this process, and we very much appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Jessica. So our next meeting is Friday, March 14th from 9 a.m. to noon. At that time, we'll have already had a bunch of the other working group meetings. So I'd love to share what I can from the other working group meetings related to fuels or anything we've been kind of discussing here. And I also know that many of you are participating in multiple groups or will listen in on other working groups. So I would encourage you to please listen in, maybe take some notes and share with us as well what you're hearing. And then we'll certainly talk about the complementary analysis. I mentioned there's an info session. I believe it's the 13th of March. So right before we'll have that meeting on Friday, March 14th. We'll discuss existing Oregon policies, and we'll, take these issues and barriers that we've identified today. I'll try to put them together and review them again, and then talk about potential policy solutions to address some of those issues and barriers. And we'll continue that into the following meeting as well. So if we can go to the next slide. if you do think of more issues and barriers you'd like to contribute to the board, or think more more detail, or have more to add, please send them to me. You can just email it directly to. We also have a public comment forum that there's members of the public who are joining us today and listening in, but are not able to participate in the Miro board or in the chat. That's a great avenue to provide some feedback. And so for your consideration, as you're thinking about these things, if you have additional issues or barriers, please send them to us. Be thinking about that next meeting when we're talking about existing policies in place to address those barriers. If there are particular policies that you're interested in or want to talk about some existing policies, and then where the opportunities are for additional policies or barriers. So if you're already thinking about that as we go into that conversation, it's going to be really helpful. And what else do we need to better understand as a whole? So we go to the next slide. And I mentioned already that we've got our public comment portal. Please, if you have additional information, please send it in there, and that's always available. Or you can certainly send information directly to me, and I'll continue to add it to the board. And as Jessica said, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you making time to do this and contribute to this process. I will follow up and share the meeting slides with you, as well as additional information, and we'll start providing more information as we're setting up to that next meeting. So thank you for your time today. Are there any last questions or anything before we end our meeting?
I think if anything crops up from folks, they know how to get in touch with you, right, Michael?
I hope so. And I will send a follow-up message after the meeting with the PowerPoint and any other additional resources, and be on the lookout for some of those meeting invites. And I'll send additional information about those modeling office hours.
Brittany, was your hand up in the panels? Okay. I'm seeing things at this point. 3-hour meetings will do that to you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.